Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Platt, Child Nutrition Consultant with the Maine Department of Education's Child Nutrition Program, and welcome to our monthly webinar series. Today, we're going to focus on procurement reviews in school nutrition programs. During this webinar, all attendees have been placed on mute. The webinar is being recorded so that you can view it at any time. So let's get started. Procurement regulations are not new, but recently state agencies have been asked to conduct reviews of school nutrition programs to assess compliance with federal regulations. This is because federal dollars are being used to make purchases, and it's important that those federal dollars are used wisely. We're going to start with an overview of procurement, and then we will go into the procurement review process. So what is procurement? It's the process that you go through to obtain goods or services at the best possible price. The process includes clearly identifying what it is you want and writing clear specifications, soliciting or seeking out bids and proposals, then looking at and evaluating the responses that you receive from potential vendors, awarding the contract or making the purchase, and finally, managing the contract to make sure you're getting what it is you agreed on. There are 4 key principles to conducting proper procurement. These include the Buy American provision, complying with federal, state, and local regulations and requirements, ensuring full and open competition, and awarding the contract to the most responsive and responsible vendor. We're going to go through each of these. So the Buy American provision is one that you're probably already familiar with. It's a requirement that SFAs must comply with when purchasing food products to be served in school meal programs. As such, this provision must be included on all procurement documents, such as specifications, the solicitation document, and the final contract that gets awarded. These are the federal regulations for procurement. It's important to note that 2 CFR 200 applies to all programs receiving federal funds and not just school nutrition programs. And the 7 CFR regulations are the ones which are specific to school nutrition programs. Keep in mind that your local requirements may be more restrictive than the federal ones, which is fine. It's just that they cannot be less restrictive. So if your local level is more restrictive, this is what must be followed. Competition is essential for purchasing quality goods at the lowest possible price. Full and open competition means that all of your potential suppliers are on a level playing field and they have the same opportunity to compete for your business. Fairness and integrity include being transparent throughout the procurement process are critical to achieving full and open competition. Some examples of ways in which competition can be restricted are placing unreasonable requirements on vendors, having unnecessary bonding or experience requirements, for example, requiring that the vendor be in business for at least 10 years. This may unnecessarily eliminate a vendor, and therefore you're restricting competition, which is not allowable. When developing product specifications, if you only request a brand name product and you do not allow an equivalent product to be bid on, and any organizational conflicts of interest, such as if you have a school board member that's president of a company you're going to be soliciting from, this could be a potential conflict of interest. You would want to make sure that you are very transparent and fair throughout the whole process. And not providing enough time for vendors to respond and submit a bid. So these are all examples of ways that competition can be restricted, and these practices are not allowable. The last principle of procurement is to ensure that the purchase or the contract is awarded to a vendor who is responsive and responsible. To be responsive means that the vendor provided all of the information you requested in the solicitation, and the products meet the specifications that you asked for. And to be considered responsible, the vendor is capable of performing under the terms and conditions of the contract. There are different methods of procurement, both informal and formal. The informal methods are micro purchase and small purchase, and the formal methods are called invitation for bid, or IFB, request for proposal, or RFP, and non-competitive or sole source. The method that you choose is going to depend on the dollar amount of the purchase that you're making and also what your needs are. These are the federal thresholds for deciding which type of procurement process you're going to follow. An informal process can be used when the dollar value of your purchase is at or below the most restrictive threshold. The federal thresholds are used here, and micro purchase procedures may be followed for a purchase at or below $10,000. Small purchase procedures may be followed for a purchase at or below $250,000, and then any purchase over $250,000 must follow formal procedures. These thresholds are when you're required to use a certain procurement method, but it is okay to be more restrictive, such as using a formal procedure when buying something less than $250,000, but you cannot be less restrictive, meaning, for example, you could not use a micro purchase procedure when you're buying something greater than $10,000. And again, if your district thresholds are more restrictive than these federal thresholds listed on this slide, you have to adhere to your local thresholds. So check with your business office to see if that's the case. So we're now going to go into each one of these methods. So micro purchase, one of the informal purchase procedures, can be used when the amount of a single transaction is less than or equal to $10,000 or your local micro purchase threshold if that's more restrictive. With micro purchases, they're distributed equally among qualified suppliers to the maximum extent that you're able to do so. With micro purchasing, you would not be purchasing from the same vendor every single time without some sort of documentation justifying why. But instead, you would be shopping from a variety of vendors and distributing your purchases, distributing your dollars equitably among vendors. It's important to note that with micro purchasing, it's not necessarily the most economical option for your program. Prices do need to be reasonable, but you would probably get better pricing by following another procurement method. The other informal method is called small purchase, and this method, also sometimes called 3 bids and a buy, can be used when the value of your purchase is $250,000 or less, or again, whatever your local threshold is if more restrictive. With small purchase procedures, you're obtaining multiple quotes from potential vendors, and you're making the purchase from the lowest priced offer. This is a competitive method of procurement, but it's not as rigorous as using the formal process, which we'll go into in a minute. When making small purchase procurements, you still have to have clear written specifications. And this is because it will allow you to make a fair and equal comparison of the same product from your multiple vendors. So for example, you're not just going to contact a vendor and say, I would like to purchase apples. Instead, you would contact the vendor with a clear specification that you'll share with all vendors you contact. For example, you might say that you want US number 1, 125, 138 count, any variety of apples. You want 5 cases delivered to each school in your district once a week from August through December. So as you can see, it provided much more detail in that second example. Price quotes can be requested by contacting vendors either by phone, email, fax, even in person, and you provide each vendor with the same exact clear specifications that you're looking for. You'll receive your responses from the vendors, and you're going to evaluate price quotes and award the contract or make the purchase from the vendor that is the lowest price, but also responsive and responsible. So if a vendor responds with the lowest price, but in the example we just listed a minute ago, let's say they're not willing to deliver the apples as requested, then they are not responsive and responsible, and you would not award them the contract. It is important that you manage the contract for compliance, meaning the vendor is doing what they agreed to do in the contract. Regardless of how you receive the quotes, they must be documented to support the process. Moving on to formal procurement procedures. These may be used for any purchase. However, the value of the purchase, if it's greater than $250,000 or your local small purchase threshold, you must follow formal procedures. The three types of formal procurement include invitation for bid, or IFB, request for proposal, or RFP, and sole source, or non-competitive. There's a lot of information on this slide. It's really important to understand the difference between an IFB and an RFP for formal procurement, because this is what allows the vendors to know what it is you're asking for, the type of contract you want to award. With an IFB, you use sealed bidding, and it will result in a fixed price for the duration of the contract. You must publicly advertise the IFB, and bids should be solicited from an adequate number of known suppliers, and you need to provide them with enough time to respond to your request prior to a public opening of the bids. Also, the IFB should describe the specs of the requested items and the minimum standards you expect in measurable terms. The contract would be awarded to the lowest price responsive and responsible bidder. This IFB process is used when you want to award a contract based solely on price. A request for proposal, or RFP, allows the vendor to respond with a proposal of how they will meet your requests. It results in a fixed price contract or a cost reimbursable contract. Cost reimbursable meaning that you pay the vendor for their cost of the item plus a fixed fee. A cost plus percent is not allowable. Just like IFBs, requests for proposals must be publicly advertised. However, there's no required public opening of the proposals, and that's because there are other steps, such as evaluating the proposals, that still need to take place before you can award the contract. The solicitation identifies the goods and services being requested and all factors that will be used when you're evaluating responses, and these factors must be clearly identified in the solicitation document. With RFPs, price alone is not the sole basis for award the way it is with an IFB, but it still is a primary consideration. You would use the RFP process when other factors, in addition to price, will be used to award a contract. So now let's dive into the procurement review process. Procurement reviews are conducted by the Maine Department of Education Child Nutrition Review staff every 5 years at the same time as the administrative review. The procurement review is based on the prior school year. However, there are times when we look at current year information. For example, if you're in a new contract with a prime vendor this year, we will review the current contract and not the one from the prior year. Much, if not all, of the review will take place off-site, meaning it's from our desk and through email correspondence with the SFA. The SFA is initially notified of the review through a notification letter, which is mailed to the superintendent in July. The letter includes information about where to download the procurement review packet, a list of requested documents to submit to your reviewer, the date that the documents are due, and the reviewer's contact information. When you complete the procurement review packet, you will be asked if you're part of a buying group and if you're in any formal contracts. You'll also be asked what your district's small purchase threshold is. You'll be asked about your procurement code of conduct and procurement procedures. Both are required policies or procedures that you should already have in place. So when completing the packet, just like we stated in the beginning, you'll be asked about the small purchase threshold. This will be the dollar amount at which you're required to conduct formal procurement. Again, the federal threshold is $250,000, so any purchase over this amount must follow formal procedures, but your local threshold may be less restrictive. More restrictive. Written codes of conduct are required to have these three elements listed on the slide at a minimum. You will review your purchasing code of conduct when completing the procurement review packet and answer the questions listed in the packet. You will also review your programs or your district's procurement procedures. This is a written document that describes how the district and or the school nutrition program conducts purchases and follows the federal regulations. When reviewing your procedures, we are looking that they're compliant with the principles of procurement we mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, and that they include at a minimum the items listed on the procurement procedures checklist handout, as well as the items listed on this slide. If you need assistance with your procurement procedures and or your code of conduct, we do have a template available on our website that you may customize to reflect your program's actual practices. If your district uses the Administrative Procedure Federal Procurement Manual for Maine school units, please be aware that this document incorrectly exempts school nutrition programs on page 14. This results in a finding, and the corrective action requires that the exceptions be removed from the manual. You will email the required documents to submit, which include your completed procurement review packet, vendor paid list from the prior school year, your code of conduct and procurement procedures to your reviewer. A vendor paid list identifies all vendors paid from the nonprofit food service account and summarizes the total amount paid to each vendor for the period of the review, which is the prior school year in most cases. We use this information to help us determine which procurement methods were used and which transactions we'll review in further detail. So using the vendor paid list, your reviewer will then select certain transactions for a detailed review and will follow up with you to request additional information. For micro purchases, this may include receipts or invoices showing that you shopped equitably from similar vendors. For small purchases, we're looking for your written specs, documentation that you attempted to get multiple quotes, and the evaluation showing a price comparison. We will also request receipts or invoices to to validate that purchases were made from the lowest price, responsive and responsible vendor. A common finding that we've seen with informal purchasing practices is purchasing from only one vendor. When we ask about this, a common response is that there's only one vendor that's willing to deliver to their district. So in this case, we would ask for documentation to support this claim. This may be email correspondence, documenting minimum delivery requirements, and a review of invoices to show that you can't meet these requirements. Or if there's one store in town and the next store would be too cost prohibitive to drive to, documentation would be needed and shared with the reviewer. We want to see that you're doing your due diligence and trying to achieve full and open competition. You should be checking with potential vendors at least annually and not buying from one just because that's who you've always purchased from. For selected formal purchases, we will request documentation showing that the invitation to bid or request for proposal was publicly advertised, the solicitation document, all vendor responses, the final signed contract that was awarded, and any related invoices or receipts. If you're part of a buying group, we'll work with you and the buying group to obtain this information. Using the formal procurement checklist, which is one of the handouts with today's presentation, we will assess the solicitation document for compliance. Some common findings that we've seen so far with formal procurements are not publicly advertising. So it's fine to email potential vendors. In fact, it's a great thing to do, but you must also publicly advertise in a statewide newspaper because, again, one of those basic principles of procurement is achieving full and open competition. So we want to make sure that any potential vendor has the opportunity to respond to your solicitation request. Another common finding is stating that the contract type is an IFB, but then issuing an RFP type contract. An IFB is a fixed price contract to the lowest price, responsible bidder, and there's no other evaluation criteria. Whereas, remember, with an RFP, it does allow for some other criteria to be considered. Another common finding is not clearly identifying the evaluation criteria in the solicitation document. So all criteria that you use to evaluate your offers must be measurable, and it needs to be identified in the document so that vendors know how they're being evaluated. And contract provisions and federal and state non-discrimination statements missing from these documents is another common finding. During the final phase of the procurement review, the reviewer will send a report to the SFA. If there were no findings, then the review is closed. If there were findings, then corrective action will be assigned, which might include revising your procurement procedures if they were non-compliant, or submitting documentation to support your procurement decisions, or if there had been an invalid contract that had been issued for formal procurement, we may even ask you to rebid that contract. So to wrap things up, if you're wondering where to start, feeling a bit overwhelmed about this process, I recommend that you start by just taking a look at your current practices. Are you just buying from a vendor just because, or do you have just reason and documentation to do so? Are you following proper procedures and doing your due diligence to achieve competition? Do you know what your district's small purchase threshold is? Is it more restrictive than the federal threshold? Are you maintaining documentation of your purchases, copies of invoices, writing down your specs when you're doing price comparisons and maintaining those, and keeping documentation from any of your formal contracts if you have any? I encourage you to locate your district's purchasing code of conduct and procurement procedures. Often these are posted with other district policies on your district website, but you may also just need to check with your administration to find them. And use the checklist that we provide and the sample procurement procedures that we offer to compare to make sure that what you have meets the minimum federal requirements. As you go through this process and review your current practices and documentation, please feel free to reach out to me or anyone else in our office with questions you may have. This webinar has been recorded, and I will make it available on our website along with the handouts. So thank you so much for your time today. I hope you have a great afternoon, everybody.